I think we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome, Argonauts, explorers, and friends, and everybody who's watching. I'm Cassandra with the Argonauts, and I'm your host for today for this very exciting Q&A with Jamie Wheal. Hey, Jamie. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Let me give you a quick overview of what is going to happen in the next hour we spend together. We are live right now on Riverside and on YouTube, but if you don't have the time to stick with us until the end, we're going to upload this whole Q&A on our website so you can rewatch it at any time. The first 45 minutes we are going is going to be more like an 101 interview with questions we already received from the audience. The last 15 minutes is where you guys come in. Everybody who's watching right now can at any point drop some questions in the chat. We will then pick them up at that very end part of our conversation. But you can also at that part join us live on stage by calling us and asking your question. As we expected, we already received so many questions, and we hope we will be able to answer all of them. But more specific questions regarding the community and some skills, we earmarked for another Q&A in the near future. So now, before we dive in, let me try to give you a proper introduction to Jamie Wheal. Jamie is executive producer of the Flow Genome Project and co-author of the Pulitzer-nominated and New York Times bestseller Stealing Fire, is an expert in peak performance leadership and neurophysiology, specializing in neuroscience and application of flow state. His new book, Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind, was just released and is as intense as it is smartly inspirational. Jamie has advised everyone from the US Naval War College and Special Operations Command, the athletes at Red Bull, to executives of Google, Deloitte, Goldman Sachs, Cisco, and the United Nations. Also, most proudly on our side, the Argonauts partner with Jamie in our upcoming 7-day Flow Canyon expedition. Today is going to be about flow and conversations. Looking at your bio, Jamie, you're all about flow. We, the Argonauts, are all about conversational fluency. And we will get back to that topic later. But first, I'm so curious about how you would describe yourself in your own words. What did you find your mission in life?
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, Cassandra. And you also just want to check, are you able to hear good, clear audio from me right
Yes,
now?
yes, I
Perfect.
do. Thank you.
Okay. So I think the simplest thing for me was a combination of scholarship and adventure. And and I wasn't really interested in just one at the expense of the other. The idea was that for me, I became fascinated, in undergraduate school in what you could sort of call neuroanthropology, which was the sort of idea of what are the habits and customs of humans? How do we do this civilization and culture thing? But then also, what are the scientific and biological mechanisms underneath the rituals, customs, habits, and taboos of how we've basically gone from, a few 100,000 naked apes to 8 billion Homo sapiens. So that's always been a fascination of mine. And I think part of that, and I'm sure many of your members who are international in their orientation have experienced this, but when you travel a lot, and my family emigrated from South Africa and England to the United States, whenever you have that kind of transnational experience, you almost always end up being an amateur anthropologist yourself anyway. You're just kind of like,
Yeah.
where is this place I've landed, and what are the strange customs, and what are the invisible rules, and what is this thing? Versus just being in it and just assuming that's. And on the other hand, I really cared for the richest, rawest, most challenging experiences in the real world. So, adventuring in the oceans, in the mountains, and in varying other challenging environments that to me felt real and alive and consequential. And it was really that's been the balance of my life. Is sort of seeking adventure and seeking really as powerful lived experiences as possible, and then going into the science and the scholarship around how we've done these things all along. And between those two, it's a fun place to hang out.
Have you already found an answer for you that is already satisfying when it comes to those topics?
Well, I mean, I think it's like Rilke, where he said, live the questions. There is without a doubt a sense of, and I think I heard somebody say once, and it stuck with me, which is, sort of our goals are often like the horizon line when you're sailing, that they can forever be the place to which you orient your movement, but you never arrive at the horizon. And so the living of the questions, right? Sort of where have we come from, and what are we doing, and what do we do now? Those questions I don't think ever get, but
But
they
isn't that
do get
frustrating?
increasingly focused. Well, I mean, okay, look. So I think I had this epiphany sitting on a picnic bench by the river where we live
Okay.
in a few years ago. And it will sound very underwhelming to anybody who's already come to this conclusion, but for me it was a revelation, which was, oh, maybe the universe doesn't pencil out with no remainder. Maybe it's an irrational number. Maybe it keeps going. Maybe it's not neat and tidy. And I realized I had spent at least a couple of decades hammering on that mathematical theorem of life, the universe, and everything, with a naive presumption that it did pencil out. And that sense of ambivalent mystery, I think, is probably a better fit than some perfected, absolutely symmetrical, comprehensible by human consciousness bottom line or final answer. So I've been kind of slowly trying to move my thinking and my orientation over to that side of it, the ledger, which is like, maybe it is just wild, chaotic, and messy. And maybe it is decidedly improbable. And maybe there isn't an answer like 42 at the end of it all.
Yeah. But also this is a huge idea to give up, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, but it was also a massive relief because I've smashed myself
Yeah.
against that brick wall for so long that to actually maybe, instead of sort of presuming some grand role or purpose for humanity, actually just sort of realizing that isn't it miracle enough to realize we're here? Like however we got here, we're here. We're
Yeah.
we're self-aware monkeys with clothes. That hurtling through space on a little blue marble, right? And able to move matter around with these opposable thumbs and able to solve problems with our prefrontal cortexes. Like that's pretty badass just by itself.
So you think this thought alone would be enough? I still don't want to give up the thought that this is the whole purpose of life. I still want to reach out for more.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a lot of people are experiencing this these days, but we are absolutely, um, you know, getting to and having to re-examine a lot of our sacred cows. And, one of the most sacred of all cows in the Western intellectual tradition is the owl. It goes way back into the origins of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and most indigenous societies and most civilizations around the world, through the hunter-gatherer phases all the way into early agrarian societies, were mostly cyclical in their versions of how they thought time went and how they thought purpose unfolded. It was fundamentally the seasons, it was fundamentally generations, whatever sort of comes around goes around. And you kind of come back to the same place in the cosmos, in your town, in the temple, in the village, in the city, whatever it would have been, that it is cyclical. And
Yeah.
the Hebrew invention of the alpha in the beginning, right? Everything started. And then the omega at the end, everything will culminate, is so profoundly baked into Western philosophical thought that it created time's arrow, right? It went from Ouroboros, the serpent that eats its tail, the cyclical time, to time's arrow. And in fact, Nobel Prize winning physicist Ilya Prigogine wrote a book specifically about that, right? Like, okay, so that is so deeply structured that almost all of our stories are stories of triumphant ascent and progress. And you realize that same hockey stick curve, right, that we have built all of our ideology on, could actually be, if you zoom out, could actually be just an arc on a bigger circle. We might have been zoomed in close to the last, to the Industrial Revolution, to 150 years of setting fossil fuels on fire, just basically just burning accumulated starlight. Millions of years of accumulated starlight from our nearest sun, that was through the miracle of photosynthesis converted into carbon. And we just happened to find a bunch of it lying around and said, woohoo, if you put a spark to this thing, right, you get all kinds of fantastic energy release,
Yeah.
right? And so we're just in this tiny little snippet of time thinking that we've been on this steady march. But in fact, we could be, if you pan back, just in a of actually cyclical time. And that's where you kind of get to, Shelley's famous poem Ozymandias, right? Where there's the great monument to the old ruler, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair, right? And
Yeah.
meanwhile, he's buried in dirt. So you're like, okay, so, now apply that same kind of fresh skepticism or scrutiny to
Yeah.
late to neoliberalism, to the ascent of democracy and free markets. And you're like, wow, a lot of things we've just taken. Francis Fukuyama, and I think it was 1989 when he wrote The End of History and the Last Man, right? It was the Berlin Wall came down and they're like, okay, man, free market democracy won. That's settled. This is a human organization and it's a steady state from here. We've literally ended history. There's nothing more to figure out. And then you look at, well, go ahead.
Let's try that. Please don't say we ended history. There's hopefully more to come.
Oh yeah. Well, he meant the
Yeah.
end of sort of innovation, or a battle of ideologies or ways of being. He really felt that, right, that once we had attained free market democracy, that was the cherry on top.
Yeah. I read a very fitting YouTube comment about you, that you are the quote machine, and now I see you live in action, which is really fun. Everything you say is quotable, and also you use a lot of very smart quotes. I love that. But I want to get back to your biography for a few seconds. What are you most proud of when you look at your life, and what do you really want people to know about you?
Well, interestingly, I've been sort of surprised by this, but and mildly dismayed by it. But people who maybe have just come across Stealing Fire and sort of read that story, or sort of see the companies or the organizations that we happen to have worked with, sort of assume that I'm some sort of Silicon Valley, horse whisperer to the tech bros, and sort of are on that kind of glitzy, technorati train. And in reality, further from the truth. My
But
partner and
how
I.
did it happen? How did that
Well,
happen?
in part because in the writing of Stealing Fire, I knew, like, the actual title, what I wanted to say was Stealing Fire: The Secret Revolution in Altered States. Because it was this idea that everybody everywhere was sort of starting to dabble and harness non-ordinary states of consciousness to increase, innovation, creativity, connection, all sorts of interesting things. And no one, I think I was at the UN, and there was a private dinner for plant medicine. And it was so it was this gathering of maybe about 20 people in a private dinner, Chatham House rules, and everybody was out, the varying projects. And this was, cannabis legalization in Jamaica, and different decriminalization efforts here and there. And they were speaking of their own personal visits to Peru and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of the dinner, everybody said, hey, all at Burning Man in a couple of weeks. You know, and I was like, wait a second. You know, I was down on Necker Island with Richard Branson and some kite surfing friends, right? And meanwhile, and they're all part of the same thing and the same circuit. And I realized, oh, I was like, wow, because I mean, at the time I was working deeply in the YPO organization, you know, both in the US, but also internationally. And I mean, and the first thing I did was go to the CFO of the organization and be like, guys, you are in massive danger of getting disintermediated right now, because YPO was a professional organization based around local access. It was effectively the country club, the fraternal organization of your city or town, right? Which had tremendous power. Back were predominantly fixed in their localities. But the moment you get this, it's Davos to South by Southwest to Coachella to Burning Man to, you know, to Art Basel, to all the different bits and pieces, and that everybody lives all over the place, everywhere and nowhere, and yet they bypassed the kind of traditional gatekeepers of power and privilege, and they were forging a different type of network that was based on shared peak experiences and shared rich experiences than it was necessarily the standard cocktail party, you know, with the spouses kind of thing. And so it became just a fascinating thread to track down. And instead, my editor made us write, you know, how Navy SEALs, the Silicon Valley, you know, et cetera, or revolution. So there was a very kind of obvious, you know, what's in it for me as a reader kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think just separating what might seem like a sort of international life of mystery from the very, very humble, straightforward beginnings, which is all I ever wanted to do was buy a mining claim in the Rocky Mountains and build an off-grid cabin and backcountry ski and mountain bike and write books. And it's taken,
Which you all achieved.
well, now we have, and I'm grateful that we didn't move our own goalposts. You know, that gets the classic thing is like, you know, if I had $1 million, there's even that, you know, that old pop song, right? I'd be rich. We used to sing that with dirt poor graduate students, you know, like holy moly. And so the fact that the things we loved and valued and cherished when we were broke ass students in our 20s are still the same things that we love and value and cherish now after fledging our kids into university and that kind of thing, that I'm grateful for. And I'm psyched to fulfill the rest of it.
Yeah, that's a great thing to be grateful for. Let's come back to the topic of the Q&A, flow and conversation. Can you explain to us what flow means to you, and from your point of view, how could it help grow conscious leadership, which ties the mission of the Argonauts?
Yeah, well, and you said flow in conversation. Did I hear that right? Yeah. So there's actually some fascinating, I mean, first of all, we'll just define some terms, right? So a flow state is really just a placeholder for what's gone by 100 different names through history and different, right? And it used to be understood as, you know, for the Greeks, they would talk about the muses kind of descending, and then there would be this sort of extraordinary ability to express or connect or invent or create, right? In the sort of Christian tradition in the Middle Ages, it would be notions of grace or but then series of one was by Abraham Maslow, where he, instead of just people with religious or spiritual beliefs, interviewed atheists and realized, oh wow, you guys have the same exact experience, you just don't attribute it to a divine or supernatural presence. Fascinating, right? So that's when Abraham Maslow coined the term peak experiences. It had to be a little bit broader. It had to include, this isn't just faith-based. And then Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a professor at the University of Chicago, continued that work, and he started interviewing everybody from rock climbers and alpinists and action sports athletes, all the way to, you know, Japanese motorcycle gangs and Korean grandmothers, and, you know, populations all around the world, different abilities, different physicality, different you know, areas of interest, and found that all sorts of people were getting into these experiences. And one of the consistent adjectives or descriptors of that experience was that it's fluid, or that it was flowy, that it wasn't forced, that it just kind of effortlessly emerged from this experience. So the simplest description, there's a very specific neurophysiological profile to it, which is basically we go from fast agitated beta waves and a lot of activity in our prefrontal cortex, a lot of executive functioning, kind of command and control, the kind of the state that most of us are in to be talking right now or listening and decoding this, definitely the state you use as leading an organization and a company. It's a highly effective tool, but it's a bit like a telescope. It can sort of it can tell you you can show you the craters of the moon, your shoes are untied. And so the idea that, French Enlightenment, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, five senses, empiricism, scientific materialism, all of those things were an incredibly powerful focusing lens that has created all the innovation and all the breakthroughs and all the developments that, we live in and enjoy. And it's also a terrible thing to be stuck in exclusively all the time. It's a little bit like the radio dial of our consciousness, and the range of our consciousness sort of got rusted shut in just one position only. And what a flow state does, what any kind of shift into a non-ordinary state, and we've just kind of defined our 21st century normal, right? It's a lot of cortisol, stress hormones, norepinephrine, adrenaline, fight, flight response, vigilance, micro PTSD, and trying to solve things mentally, cognitively. That when you get to shift that dial, you actually get to pick up a different bandwidth of information, and we get to shift. So Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, who's a brilliant neuroscientist, wrote a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Right? And it was basically the idea of, like, look, when animals face threat, challenge, one, the grazing, the minute a lion backs out of the well, maybe one of them's unlucky, but the other ones 15 minutes later are back to grazing, right? And so that's why
Yeah.
they task switch, and they also have a range of, like, run for your life versus this grass is good. And humans don't, right? We get fixated. So we're driving back through traffic, or we're lying in bed at night rehashing a conversation from work or with our spouse or whatever it is, and we don't have an off switch. So flow states really provide a vital, busting up of that rusty knob, and let us expand more of our states of consciousness. And in those states, the gatekeeper of our prefrontal cortex, the gatekeeper of our inner critic, typically goes offline. And there's fascinating, neuroanatomical reasons for that, and all the sort of what's under it. But basically, we get drawn into the deep present. We cease obsessing about the past or the future. And generally, our inner critic, that sort of constant narrative voice in our minds, that's often usually not that kind. It might have embodied the voice of a parent or a coach or a particularly traumatizing professor or whatever it is. But that's our inner critic, and that goes quiet. And as a result of those things, we tend to have access to more information and inspiration than we normally do. And nitric oxide, which is a neurotransmitter in our brain, and Herbert Benson at Harvard did some fascinating research on this. He actually called it the bliss molecule. It actually flushes away that vigilance, flushes away all the stress chemicals, and actually replaces them with pain, basically, anandamide. It prompts lateral connections in which actually reduce pain and make us feel better. Those are sort of the internal opioids of our body and brain, and dopamine, of reward for finding something new, for novelty. So our brains light up, and we have access to much more data, and we're able to make unusual or novel connections between data points or nodes of reality or possibility that we normally can't see. So that's the aha moment. Right? That's where the Greeks were talking about the muses. But to really bring this back to the Argonauts, right? One of the most fascinating findings from the field has emerged is that group flow, so the idea of not just me having that experience at a potter's wheel, or composing music, or sliding down a mountain on skis, not just me by myself doing it, but me doing it with other people, is twice as rewarding. We actually get twice the neurochemical boost than we do by ourselves. So that's if we go skiing together, or if we're listening to music together. But the final piece, and I think this is maybe, perhaps one of the stated or unstated goals of the Argonauts, you actually end up in, so what I just described, the 2x return is sort of what would be called parallel play. Like we're both doing the same thing within eyesight next to each other, right? But
Yeah.
then there's interdependent flow, which is much
Hmm.
more like a jazz band or a football team, where we're doing the thing together, and in order for me to get there, you've got to get there, and then we get there and do the thing together. And that's actually 3 times, it's 300% more rewarding than just doing it by ourselves. So
Quick
an impersonal,
question, but if a jazz band is doing that or a football team is doing that, usually what happens before that, what happens before a play, an official play, they practice a lot. Do we need some kind of practice to do that all together?
absolutely. I mean,
I think we have lost Amy. Let's try to. Ah, at least your voice is back, I think.
okay. Well, I'll tell you what. We will work.
Nah,
Keep describing the point.
internet is
So
not on our side today. Oh, we have you on video as well.
great,
That is an upgrade.
great, and your point about practice is essential,
Okay.
because so effortless and easy once we get into it. It can be really tempting to conclude, if close my eyes and take my hands off the steering wheel and magic will happen. But the reality is, and obviously the musical example is a great one, which is you actually have to spend an awful lot of time testing your scales, mastering your technique, so that you can get to that place where group flow is ready to happen, and you have the technical foundation to be able to live into that.
Interesting. Um, you go in your book, at least let me check the time. Okay, we still have 30 minutes. So, to everybody who's watching live right now, please, you're always encouraged to drop your questions in the chat and I will pick them up later. So if you have any spontaneous questions, just write them in the chat, and in the last 15 minutes, we will try to pick them up, and maybe you, Jamie, can also choose your favorite questions and answer them. Um, for the organizers, the upcoming Flow Canyon expedition, how does this tie into the hedonic calendaring and embodied practices you speak about in your book, and of course you live in your everyday life?
Yeah, I mean, it's the simplest is it's a hell of a lot more fun than sitting in a Four Seasons conference room with no windows looking at PowerPoint.
Yes.
Right.
Great.
So, right. So in fact, Kurt Hahn, the famous early 20th century German educational theorist, and he was both the mentor of Philip and then also the founder of Outward Bound, said something great. He said in the mountains, feedback is instant, and that when you get outside of the civilized world, where you go past where the sidewalk ends, we get much tighter feedback loops on our leadership and on our choices and on our actions. And that can be as simple as I didn't look where I was going and fell off a cliff, or I didn't secure my sleeping bag and now it rolled down to the bottom of the stream and it's soaking wet and I have to sleep in it for 3 nights until it dries. I dropped my spoon in the snow and now I'm eating out of my, eating my macaroni cheese with my hands. Like those feedback loops are near instant. And if you compare that to most corporate settings with annual performance reviews or maybe quarterly strategic meetings and KPIs and that kind of stuff, it gives us many, many, many more cycles, much faster. And it's not a question of whether I can talk my way out of it or whether I can deny it or deflect it or explain it. It's just, it is what it is. And so that's one part that's really important. And we actually take that to, an extreme, actually, where we do not just 360 feedback, which is often somewhat of a wishy-washy exercise, but we do 720-degree feedback. So We start with a Harvard psychographic where every leader comes in and assesses basically what operating system are you running, right? Are you running Windows 95? Are you running 2000? Are you running something I haven't even heard about, right? And so you get a sense of what level of complexity you're operating at. And then we go down into these beautiful canyons just off the Colorado River, so the river that makes the Grand Canyon, down into these ancient canyons. And we spend a day, each day, moving through the levels of consciousness, moving through the levels of human culture and awareness. So we start with, day one is let's be at fight, flight, survival. This is equivalent to being a hunter gatherer, and you learn everything from how to start fires with sticks to how to build brush shelters to how to sleep by yourself in a wild environment. And then we move up each day into tribes, and then into armies, and then into every man or woman for themselves, and then into collective cooperation above all that. And so
So,
the idea, well, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. So hands-on, what are the things you're going to take away as being a conscious leader? How does that improve your performance or your day-to-day life?
Well, I mean, the other thing, I mean, I
Is that good? We worked out
still
before, so he's gonna be back again in 3, 2, 1. Yay! You're back.
great. So the other element, right, is that most of us lead pretty pampered lives, right? We set the thermostats at 72 degrees. We have refrigerators filled with thousands of calories just across the couch from us. Um, Experiencing the full range. What does it mean to be a bold leader? And despite, a lot of the self-congratulatory talk at conferences about captains of industry and shaping the world, most of us probably have a sense that it's like, yeah, I think there's a little bit more to this. Or I think that if I was a leader born in another time and place, that a little bit more might be asked of me. So
Yeah.
getting to go into the natural sublime, a wild and rugged place where you're outside of clock time and you're in geologic time. You're literally looking at a million years, and the story told in the sandstone. You're seeing sunrises and sunsets and shooting stars and all these things. It's a profound reset. And, people have gone to the wilderness to seek inspiration and renewal for thousands of years. That's not a new approach, but it can
Yeah.
be profound. And then to also get deeply into our bodies and to experience the sharp edge of surviving and thriving versus just feathering our nest, just adding one more feature to our gilded cage, right? That can be profoundly inspiring and renewing. And to do it with peers, to do it that are not dependent or beholden to you, that are actually equally capable and competent and can offer you feedback when you're not sitting in your corner office, when you're not controlling the narrative, but when you're out there on the raggedy edge of, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know
Yeah.
if I can do this, and the ability to support each other and the
Yeah.
ability to find where our deeper edges are and begin polishing them becomes a profound gift of renewal.
Yeah, yeah, it strips away all the titles we created for ourselves, all the insecurities or things we're proud of in our day-to-day life, and sets you to this bare experience where you have to learn to swim again, maybe, and do that collectively.
Yeah, and
Um,
a funny thing though
yeah,
is just that we put so much effort into the instructional design of this program because our passion and our interest was we want to create the world's best elite leadership training. This is basically like Navy SEALs BUDS, that famous kind of screening process. Sort of a gentleman's buds, right? We wanted to have, top shelf business school and academic theory and all these things and layer it in and make it an amazing experience. But one of the most consistent bits of feedback we got was, holy smokes, you have no idea how profound it is to not check my phone for a week. You know?
I imagine the thought alone beforehand is quite scary, but
Yeah,
as you said, afterwards it can be a relief.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, Let's get into your book for a few minutes. I'm gonna read again the full title of your book because it's so epic. It's called "Recapture the Rapture: Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind." It's a very intriguing title, and I'm sure many of us here live today would agree that the world has lost its mind. But could you please tell us what you mean by recapturing the rapture?
Sure. And and I mean, and sort of tragically, we're seeing an example of some of these factors right now, in Jerusalem and everywhere else. But we're seeing a crashing and smashing together of everybody's end times end game. So, and you can see this. I don't know how prevalent the news coverage is of something like QAnon in Germany and through Europe, US at
We've
least,
heard
and I think
about that.
it's been rippling through the world, right? Absolutely batshit crazy meta conspiracies about
Yeah,
what's quote unquote really going on. But
yeah.
we're also seeing it in Silicon Valley. We're seeing it in a lot of techno utopian notions. And one of the key insights I had that inspired the book was to realize, once you understand the structure underneath a rapture, and it typically has four steps. It basically has drawn to the conclusion that the world as we know it is not savable. Now, traditional religious ones might say it's because of sin or moral decay, but contemporary technological ones might say it's because of overconsumption or macroeconomic instability or some other calculation. But that they come to the conclusion this world can't be fixed. But there's an inflection point coming soon and we can see it from here. So again, for traditional religious-based ones, that will be some form of, divine intervention, some form of culmination of the history of their people or believers. But for techno-utopians, it could be when we get our Mars colony, or when quantum computing has a breakthrough, or AI, crushes the Turing test, and we now have that, or even when we can, upload our minds to the singularity, like the Matrix, right? So everybody's got a version of that. And then the key here is that the step three is on the other side of that inflection point. Everybody, like our people, and again, that's a 1% solution, but how you slice the 1% depends on who you approaches. It could be the believers, the elect, the saved. It could be the meritocratic best and brightest. It could be the billionaires who can afford a ticket. It doesn't, like it gets cut a bunch of different ways, but it's only ever a 1% solution. On the other side of the inflection point, our people end up better, not worse. And then the fourth step is because of the first three, now we should accelerate as fast as possible to that keyhole event, and never mind the collateral damage in the world we're leaving behind. And so once you sort of see that shared structure, you realize, oh my gosh, rapture ideology around us. And it's not just wearing sandwich boards and ringing a bell saying the end is nigh, or wired up to suicide vest. It's actually wearing black mock turtlenecks and Patagonia fleece vests. And there's all sorts of rapture ideologies around us. And as long as we sit back and don't acknowledge that the seductive promise is that somehow if we buy into one of those, we don't have to solve our collective world problems, and I believe I get a golden ticket to the other side. I think that's really important for us to sort of pause and say, hey, actually, those are all sociopathic solutions. And it's really critical that people who like and it leaves out 99% of us, it leaves the rest of us. And how do we actually get really clear on the stakes and start acting and leading and innovating from places that keep in mind not just can I get my escape ticket, but build a world that generations from now.
But wouldn't all of us have to submit to that idea in order for it to work?
Well, I mean, I think, and there's all sorts of research on this, but Erica Chenoweth at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard has famously conducted research on what does it take for large-scale social change. And she studied a ton of civil rights movements and other social, social justice and movements for positive change, ranging from Gandhi and Mandela to smaller episodes in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and, all across the world. 20th century was her data set. And she came to the conclusion that fairly consistently, the sort of the magic number for the sort of the tipping point to go from status quo business as usual to meaningful social change was 3.5% of the population. And
That
she
is
also
not that
found
much.
10 million people in the US, and
Yeah.
easy math for anybody else's national populations. And she also came to another interesting insight, which is, I think, super critical right now because things are getting so fractious, which is that nonviolent approaches to this are twice as effective as violent. So the force multiplier of peaceful, nonviolent, social protest and change is arguably the most powerful tool we have in our toolkit right now. It's just most of us are divided, most of us are distracted, and some of us are potentially bargaining, right? That we might be able to kind of bypass this whole thing anyway, so it doesn't quite matter if it doesn't pencil out for everyone.
Not that I thought I would be like kind of losing hope when talking to you because you create all of these horror scenarios, but that small number of people and also non-violent, that shows us that there's a real chance to get the message out there.
Absolutely. I mean, here's the thing, right? I mean, I wouldn't have taken the time to write this if it didn't seem like there's something powerful there. But I think it's very much, and it's that New Testament story. I think it's a great one, and I think it's pretty relevant. I mean, in fact, the Old Testament, New Testament, they both speak of this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Job. Actually, never, not Job. Job is a different story that is also helpful, but it's Jonah, right? Jonah's a really
Yeah.
successful businessman. He's
Yeah.
killing it. And Yahweh comes to him and says, "Hey, dude, you got to go save the people of Nineveh. They're straying from the path." And he's like, "Nah, man, I'm busy. I got things. I got irons in the fire. I can't do this." And he even tries to duck it. And everybody knows the story. Hops on the boat, gets chucked overboard, swallowed by the whale, all the bits, right? But he's finally like, "Okay, I'll do it." And then in the New Testament, there's a comparable one where I think Jesus goes to the Sea of Galilee, and there's like four brothers got brand new fishing boats and new nets, and they're like, "Look, man, we're gonna crush it." Like we are gonna be like the fisher kings of Galilee. And he's like, "Nah, sons." He's like, "When are you gonna put down your nets and go and be fishers of men?" Right? And
Mm.
so there is that call to adventure. There is that sense of like, hey, if you look back through history, it's never been a rose garden. It's never been easy. We've just become fat, happy zoo animals in the last half century, right? So
Yeah.
we just need to shake that off. That's the part that I am sort of ruthlessly willing to dismantle, but
Yeah.
not to break us down to nothing. It's actually to free us from the layers of numbness and consumption and distraction to say, oh, hell, man, if we look at Leonidas and the Spartans, 300 at Thermopylae, holding off 100,000 Persians. If you look at, the examples, Dietrich von Bonhoeffer, right? Like, if you look at the examples of somebody who, against all odds, with their back against the wall, does the thing they must without regard for their own pain or pleasure, right? Those moments send shockwaves through history. And they
Mm.
also serve as beacons that other people alight to. It's like, do you want to be the Vichy French, or do you want to be the French resistance? Like, these are the choices we have
Yeah.
time and time again. And so that's the actual power. And Gandhi called it satyagraha. And I was but India was the British crown, right? Miserable,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely ruthless. And rather than seeking revenge and bloodshed, Gandhi popped it up a layer and he said, hey, there's this thing, satyagraha, truth force. And truth force can change the world. And then Martin Luther King was inspired by that concept, but he's like, well, that's a mouthful, insanity. I understand what that is. So I'm going to call it soul force. And in his March on Washington speech in 1963, right? He says, when we can meet physical force with the power of soul force, right, then we can change the world. And so that commitment, it means, you know, I don't know how broad these examples are, but I'm sure you guys have your analogs where someone has a terminal cancer diagnosis or a near-death experience, and they sort of come back with a sort of a clarity and a freedom, right, that most of us don't have. And they write books and they make movies about them, and everybody, you know, sort of hangs on their every word as if they've received some mysterious insight or gift or initiation. And we crave, you know, what they have to share with us. But the reality is that we can all do that. We can all get really, really clear on what matters beyond seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. When we do that, we get to show up at full strength. And I think that's
Yeah.
also, you know, I mean, obviously the US Navy SEALs have done tons of tremendous and heroic work, but I think part of the kind of the fetish or the fact of them is this is a band of brothers who have bonded together around something much more than their own personal comfort. So we crave these things. And I think the Argonauts are a phenomenal example of a contemporary effort to bond people together with ties that bind beyond the transactional, beyond the mutually beneficial, and into something supporting really transformational community. And it just feels like we just need more of that, just more of that everywhere, as soon as
Yeah.
possible.
Great. Great. And that's also a great last word for our first part of the 60 minutes. The first 45 minutes are already over. We didn't even get to touch on so many questions. I still have. It's so interesting to talk to you. But let us have a quick look into the real Q&A part, in the live Q&A part, with questions that came in our chat. And also, I see somebody is calling. I'd say we try to pick the caller up first. He's been on the line for a very long time. Let's try that. So, hello, Sebastian.
Oh,
Hi.
hi.
How
Thanks a
are you
lot.
doing?
I'm very fine. Actually, I just got a vaccination and I'm super groggy. And
Oh, okay.
this is also why I clicked this button. I don't have a clear question right now.
Okay, that's
But
fine.
I'm very thankful, and I think at this point in time, I'm just gonna listen. Thanks a lot
All right.
for doing
Would
this
you be so kind and just
interesting thing.
click the hang up button so I don't
Sure.
have you throw you out of
My
the
bad.
call? Don't worry. So, is there something maybe Jamie in the chat that sticks out to you that you want to hop on, or shall I just pick the first question?
Oh, I would say go for it. Yeah, I'm happy to
Okay.
field anything coming your way.
All right. Liz said, what can be our individual contribution to this inflection point? And as a community, how does this connect to social resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. And I was actually, and thank you for asking it because I wanted to speak into that if the chance came up. I think the simplest thing is to actually take on the responsibility of being the powerful leaders that you are. And again, like a good example is like, were I a century ago or 1,000 years ago, who would I have been? Who would I have been leading? How would my skills that I have today, how would they have shown up then? And really double down on that. I gave a talk to Goldman Sachs, about 1,000 of Goldman Sachs's senior partners at the world headquarters at the Twin Towers, right there in the heart of the financial district. And the question I posed to them is sort of, probably a little harder edged because they're Goldman, but I was like, hey, look, in the 1950s, one of their famous partners coined a phrase. He said, be short-term patient, but be long-term greedy. And that kind of became a rallying cry for Goldman. No surprise, you can kind of see it in their track record, right? But my question to them at the time was, well, wait, how can you be long-term greedy if we're not necessarily certain there's going to be a long term? There's a lot of meaningful information these days of potentially not indefinitely sustainable status quo. We can just leave it at that, right? So the question is like, okay, what is our purpose? And I think the first thing would be is to, I'm a huge fan of the free market, but like Nietzsche said about Christianity, there really only ever was one Christian nailed him. So I think the notion of freeing the market, we need entrepreneurs, we need inventors, we need people to bring through what isn't yet, but must be. So can we double down, not commerce of late stage capitalism, right? Because it's not a free market. It's not even close to a free market. We have absolute and utter rent seeking. So we have incumbents, jimmying the system, and whether that's with IP and patents or whether that's with legislation that digs a moat behind them, like Warren Buffett said, like that's it's not a free market. And we also have the tragedy of the commons, which, if folks are familiar with game theory, comes from like the multipolar trap, which basically means if someone's going to grab a slice of cake for sure, then it doesn't need to be polite. I should grab it because someone's going to, right? And what that means is we end up with tragedies of the commons. And whether that's oceans and overfishing, whether that's forest and deforestation, whatever it would be, anything that's not nailed down, someone grabs because it's pretty certain someone else would if they didn't. And so can we get back to freeing the market so that it can support innovation and creativity, and it can support the development of the things we need? And so my simplest sense is, and this would be more of an inquiry for down in the canyons, where we're actually tighter and closer and we're surrounded by profound nature, and it just supports this kind of long time scale reflection. But, either we're part of the problem or we're part of the solution. And I don't mean that in a cliched way. I just mean take a look at what your businesses are, right? And think, we don't need more plastic widgets, we need more weapons of war. We don't need more apps that replace our mothers doing our laundry or delivering our groceries or cooking our food, right? We need, and whether you sign off on the UN's SDG goals or whatever, it's like, take your pick. There's long lists of things that we desperately need, right? And let's put our efforts into innovating those. And whether that's the X Prizes and those kinds of challenges. If you think of World War II, if you think of like, hey, there were all these factories. I mean, in COVID, right? There was this massive conversion with 3M and other big companies into making ventilators, into generating masks. Like, we've got all this infrastructure, we've got all this logistics, we've got all this know-how. How do we direct it away from basically mindless and unsustainable consumption into actually innovating with the best we've got? And I think of leaders of organizations have asymmetric capacity to change the system for the better.
I was thinking that this is kind of a fearful maybe action that we like cling on, hold on to the things we know and seek us comfort. And it would have to take a leader to step back from that idea.
Yeah. The good news is, right, and we've only just touched on flow states and these kind of things, but the reality is that profound non-ordinary states of bliss, inspiration, healing, connection, all of these things are actually more available to us now than they've ever been through human history. They used to be tightly cloistered, secretive, held in little groups or esoteric societies. But now we just kind of, we know how to go and have these experiences, whether it's with transcranial magnetic stimulation and EEG things, whether it's with new pharmacology, whatever it would be, right? We can do these. And so the keys to our cage, to kind of getting out of that sort of bourgeois worried, well, I have all the things, but I'm still not happy. Like, the keys to our cage are also the keys to the kingdom, right? We actually have to have a chance to apprehend the things that used to be the domain of sages, saints, and mystics, but we can actually go there ourselves. So the question is do we actually step out of our cage, right? And there's that great Pink Floyd song that says, did they get you to trade a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage? And most of us, successful, commercial, entrepreneurial, we've created gilded cages for ourselves. And the question is there something more? Is there something deeper? Is there something nobler in me to do than just optimize my and my margins and my and can I take
Yeah.
that skill set towards, again, 7 generations, right? What our great grandchildren? Can we start playing the game for them?
Yeah. Let's try to bring in a very good question from Jim Glennon on that topic as well. Why are so few people or so few prepared to pay the price and make the individual sacrifice necessary to affect change non-violently?
Well, that's just the monkeys with clothes thing. I mean, you know, you can. There's so many different like theological, cosmological interpretations as to why we are how we are. But you know, some of them are like, we are both. We've got our animal nature and our angel nature, right? We've got our sort of our humanity lies at the intersection of our mortality and our. And trying to figure that out has always been a puzzle. So I think there really has to be either inspiration or suffering that moves us off that needle of transactional relating. And I didn't, if I'd known this 20 ton of heartache, but he defined, I just read this like a year ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. He defined 3 different types of relationship. And this is probably, beautifully appropriate for you guys as the audience. He said there are transactional relationships. Basically, it's quid pro quo. I'm only in relationship with you to get something I want. There's hedonistic relationships. We hang out because it's fun. You've got the best wine, the best cigars. You got your plane, and we hop to Ibiza. We do whatever we do, and this is fantastic. And I don't really care that much. But if things get rough, if things are no longer fun, I'm probably not still there. I've moved on to the next party. Friendships, the virtuous relationships, and that is where we extend ourselves in service of our own and each other's growth. Right, and those are a much rarer subset, but arguably what we need. And those are small batch bespoke solutions. Like, you have to start, and you guys are, right? You guys are in your community. You guys are digging deep into those wells. You're sharing your lives and and your projects and your burdens. And in fact, where is this? Nicole just asked a great question, which is, did Maslow, we were just talking about, people think of his stuff as a pyramid, the hierarchy of needs, did he stop too short? Fascinatingly, our buddy Scott Barry Kaufman, who studied under Martin Seligman at Penn, and he's been teaching at Columbia and elsewhere, just wrote a book called Examination of Hidden Unpublished Papers, but right before he died. And what it turned out is that self was on top of the pyramid for the baby boomers, the kind of hippie generation, which was like, go and find yourself, let's do personal stuff, wasn't the top of his pyramid. The final step in Maslow's pyramid was self-transcendence. That he didn't mean, on a spaceship. He meant self-transcendence meant, okay, I'm over myself, and I'm now coming back in selfless service. And that really feels like a missing link in many of our, which is the ultimate goal, is to become ultimately ordinary, deeply ordinary, and to have climb the mountain, but then to come back down into the valleys and pick up a hoe and start gardening.
Yeah. How do you think we can achieve that?
I mean, it's inside out and outside in. People say, oh, change only comes from within. If you want peace in the world, you have to find peace in yourself. And you're like, yeah, that's true-ish, but it's also a very slippery and comforting excuse for bourgeois seekers to just keep going to their weekend workshops and yoga retreats, right? So it's both, right? It requires agency. It requires thinking of the machinery of legislation and elections and all the things, and it also includes interior shifting and changing so that we can see and hold both the problems and the solutions from a higher level perspective. And again, I mean, these guys always get name checked together, but the Gandhi Kings and Mandelas of the world, right? Every single one of them could have reacted at the level of their people. Their people were hungry for blood. Their people were hungry for revenge and retribution, and understandably. And all three of those folks said, nope, there's a higher thing here, right? I mean, Mandela could have dismantled Springboks rugby stadium. He could have said, this is a symbol of Afrikaner apartheid and we're trashing it, forget it. And he said, no, actually, let's play the infinite game. Let's play a higher game where our team is now going to represent Rainbow Nation. Our team is now going to represent the hopes of a post-apartheid. Not in the playbook of the ANC. That was not in the playbook of other. Right? That was a higher level perspective. Interior change and development to get to be able to unlock soul force, right? That world-changing 3.5% is essential. It is insufficient, right? We need operators, right? Who understand contemporary secular power. We need people who can also carry that into the halls of government and commerce and help shift things there too. It's all required.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, we already received the end of our Q&A session. The time flew by so quickly. Thank you so much for being here again and letting me ask you all of this question. I hope all of you, everybody who's watching right now, had an inspirational time. I'm sure I had. I hope you guys do. And if you want to see this whole video again, it will be live on our YouTube channel, and you can also watch us on our main show. Jamie, you have the last word.
Well, thank you, Cassandra. It's been a delight to get to chat with you. I think that the simplest is sort of what I playfully end the book with, which is no matter what, right? Stay awake, build stuff, and help out. As laser focused on leaders and entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Stay awake. Remember who you are and build stuff. Like help us all collectively figure it out. And it doesn't pick yours and go. Start. And if you've already started, share where you came to those conclusions, and the help out.
Oh, yeah.
Right, the least brothers and sisters. Right, if we can start expanding our sphere of concern and compassion, we can bring more folks through this with more joy and more play and less hardship than if we don't.
Sounds good. Also very inspiring and encouraging. Thank you, Jamie.
For sure.
Bye.